Hi, I'm here with Associate Professor Ben Spies Butcher, co-author along with Ben Phillips and Troy Henderson of the article Between Universalism and Targeting, Exploring Policy Pathways for an Australian Basic Income. Associate Professor, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much for having me, Michael.
Just to orient the conversation a little, what is the basic income and why hasn't it happened yet?
So basic income is regular payment that goes to everybody. So fortnightly or monthly or weekly, and everyone gets it regardless of anything. So it has no conditions associated with it. It's become much more popular recently, although it's had waves of popularity going back even a couple of hundred years. But there are a number of reasons why it potentially hasn't happened. It really hasn't happened in that form anywhere. There's been experiments with it, trials of it. There are some experiments which are kind of permanent, look a little bit more like it, but nothing that's quite it. And so some of the reasons why it might not happen, it's very expensive. It seems to breach a redistributive norm by giving money to rich people. And it doesn't necessarily fit in with the way the rest of the welfare state works, which is often linked to our work incomes. It's less so in Australia, but in many countries around the world is a bit more like job keeper than job seeker. And people often receive income based on what their wages were. And that protects people from risks a bit more, because obviously if you're paying off a mortgage or you have to pay the rent and you've got kids at school and stuff, just going down to what we consider in our unemployment benefit that's a big drop. So in a lot of countries you would get 80% of your wage or something like that. So it doesn't seem to fit with policy. It's expensive and it gives money to rich people. That's why it hasn't happened, but it's a really interesting idea.
Just to do a little more clarification, you use the term basic income. You don't use the term universal basic income in the paper, and you also introduced this concept fairly centrally in the paper, I thought, of affluence tested basic income. So are we talking about a universal credit? And maybe if you could speak a little to the particular advantages of your design.
Yeah, so there's a lot of very nerdy debate about how basic income might work in practice. And we completely engage in that, but we try to do so in a way that's talking about the politics that come from it. So a universal payment to everyone, so everyone gets $1,000 a week or a fortnight. That's what most people understand by universal basic income. But there's lots of ways you can achieve exactly the same outcome that are structured slightly differently. When we start earning money now, if you're on job seeker or if you were on the unemployment benefit, you start earning money, you lose some of that money as you earn more money. The government takes some of it away. That's means testing. And at the same time, as you start earning money, the government also starts taking some of it away for tax, for income taxation. And essentially we were saying, look, there's no logical difference between these two things. You earn an extra dollar and you lose some money. We should treat them together, and we should look at how much money you lose per dollar that you earn. And the principle that should guide that should be the same principle as a tax system, which is that people on lower incomes lose less of their money, they keep more of it, and people on higher incomes lose more of their money. Yeah, that's not actually how the system works now, because the means tests on income payments are much bigger, much stricter than the income tax system. So you can lose 60 cents in the dollar when you start getting work. While as our top tax rate is less than 50 cents. So our approach was to go, well, we could have a universal payment that really did go to everyone, and then we could fund it by increasing taxes. But that seems a bit crazy if that's the same as a benefit withdrawal rate. Why don't we just count the initial bit of tax as if it's a benefit withdrawal, rather than counting it as a tax? That's literally what we did. And that means that most people still get a payment, like way up the income scale to people who are earning over $100,000 a year, but they get a smaller one the more they earn as they're starting to pay tax. And so we call that affluence testing rather than means testing, because it excludes the affluent rather than only targeting the very poor. We think that that's politically really important, because payments that only target the very poor tend to be stigmatized. They tend to be subject to a politics where the tabloid media talks about dole bludgers. That's politically really divisive. It makes it hard to campaign to make those payments better. I think that's a lot of why Newstart hasn't increased in Australia is because of that divisive politics. Well, if you look at the age pension, family payments, most families get some family payment, even though it does decrease with your income. And that has made it much harder to attack politically. It's meant that governments of both colours have increased it. And so we think that that creates the kind of political coalition building that is needed to defend this payment, make it better, and create a more egalitarian society.
Yeah, okay, I think I understand that. Just before we started this interview, we were talking about the difference between an individualist-based system and a family-based system. Is this particular, could you explain how this credit works in relation to switching to the individual-based system a little? Just on that same question.
So one aspect of the system I've been talking about, which is including more people in the payment structure, yeah, and making the tax and welfare systems speak to each other. But part of that is that our tax system is built on a different logic than our welfare system. The tax system is about individuals, the welfare system is about households. So when you go and apply for Newstart or Job Seeker, you get assessed against your partner's income. Whereas in the income tax system, you don't pay more tax because your partner earns money on them. So you have to universalise those things and bring them together. Now, one of the things we think is really important, we don't talk about it as much in the paper, is that we move to that individual model, because at the moment, that rule that says we should test people against their household income, it might sound fair, you know, sure, a household that has more income doesn't need extra income as much as one that doesn't have any. But it means that the government has a legal reason to find out who you're sleeping with and whether you're in a relationship. And anyone who's gone through filling in those forms at Centrelink knows they ask pretty intrusive questions. We know from the evidence around inquiries into domestic violence, households that are split up that still have children, where people don't have enough money to rent a house, so they might cohabit to some extent. We know that this evidence is used to create debts for very low income people, which can eventually see them end up in jail. It means that the government has a reason to prosecute you because you might sleep with one of your flatmates, you're not in a relationship, but the government now has a reason to even find that out and then to try and take you through the courts to prove it so they can get money off you. And we think that that's just not that's not an appropriate way to run a tax and welfare system in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's a really interesting framing for the basic income idea, that the value of the universal part is not just efficiency or anything like that, but just moving past this, what you really showed pretty convincingly is a pretty incoherent double system. So framing segues really nicely into what I think the paper is really all about, which is how we might move towards this sort of policy becoming a reality in Australia. You look at the policy trade-offs and the policy framework that would need to be in place to get us there. So what do you think is the pathway towards a basic income in Australia, and what do you think the biggest obstacles are on that pathway?
Yeah, so I think the pathway is basically the two steps we've talked about. So one is about individualising payments, and the other is about loosening those taper rates. So that, you know, we're currently having a debate about tax cuts in Australia, and that's about encouraging people to work more and to boost the economy. But it would be much, much more effective, instead of to reduce taxes for people on quite high incomes who are probably already working full time, to reduce the taper rates for those people who are combining market and social income. So there's actually a lot of people, a growing number of people, because of underemployment, because of casualisation and part-time work, who are on government benefits, but are also receiving market income. And those people face these really high taper rates. So they know they're losing 60 cents in the dollar. And it seems a logical pathway is just to reduce that down, so it looks more like the first marginal tax rate, yeah? Doing that, you can imagine if you take less of each dollar, people on higher incomes still get the payment. And so you gradually start to universalise the payment to more and more people up the income stream as you reduce that taper rate. So that seems like a plausible staged approach that doesn't require a one-off big bang hit of money. It's a series of amounts of money that you could imagine being subject to, you know, promises in an election campaign. it gives money to people on low and middle incomes who are much more likely to spend it and who are much more sensitive to their marginal tax rate. Yeah. So people who are much more likely to go, oh, well, it actually does make sense for me to take the extra shift at Woolworths because I get to keep more of the money. And those people are not earning $150,000, right? They're not making decisions about whether they work an extra day or not. It's people who are on lower middle incomes are much more likely to do that. So this has some really good incentive effects, but it seems to be a plausible pathway to doing that. And we think that that could be something that would, the more that happens, the more people who are getting some of the payment, the more popular it becomes politically to help people out with a little bit more of it. And so we think that it also could build its own momentum politically as well. Individualism payments, I think, does face a series of political obstacles because there's a really strong mindset in Australia that we should target stuff to people most in need, and that seems to breach that principle. And obviously it's expensive, and that's going to be always going to be a barrier. Although who knows, in post-COVID times, maybe money doesn't really mean what it used to mean.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Okay, finally, I have a bit of a provocation for you. I'm really interested in the new financialization literature, the emerging financialization literature, and particularly the argument from Sydney Uni professors Martijn Konings and Lisa Atkins on the asset economy.
Mm.
They claim that in the 20th century in Australia, it was quite possible for most waged earners to save up enough to acquire assets, essentially to partake in the property market and to partake in the appreciation of value of things like houses. In today's economy, that's no longer possible. You basically need a wealthy benefactor in order to get into the asset market at all. And alongside this, they claim that increasingly the only viable path to a good life fulfilling modern expectations is through asset ownership. So more and more people are being locked out of this. And the good life depends not on the quality of your wage and income as it used to, but rather on your ownership of financial assets. So my question for you in this intervention on, which is essentially in this area of income rather than asset ownership, is any intervention aimed at boosting income missing the big picture? Or maybe as a reframing, is the basic income a good idea for a Fordist economy and a post-Fordist economy, but not necessarily a solution for a financialized economy?
It's a great question, and it's a really interesting thesis too. And I don't think we're at odds with it, but I think the conclusion is it's actually better for a post-Fordist financialized economy. And that's not because it's going to bring down capitalism, but then again, neither did Fordism. Right? Fordism was actually about centering waged work, which was the very center of the wage-labour capital relationship that it was seeking to try and overcome the problems of. Yeah. So it didn't get rid of wage labour. It made it completely and totally central to people's lives, but in a way that was more secure and fairer for people. Yeah. So it is also very true that financialisation has meant that capital gains in particular are one of the main ways that people make money now. But if you look at how finance is working, increasingly the way it makes money, the way it creates new assets, is by assetizing the streams of income associated with people undertaking normal social reproduction. So being able to get a house through their mortgage, childcare fees, stuff with aged care, health insurance, their pension, all of those sorts of things, yeah? And so those streams of income are turned into assets. Now, one of the things that hints at is that streams of income are actually very similar to assets. Having guaranteed income streams, or in fact, guaranteed social goods, guaranteed housing, guaranteed healthcare, protect you from the process of assetization. They do almost the same thing, but they're entitlements. They actually have the property of assets. So if we were to say, what is collateralization? It's buying an income stream. Right? That's what it is. That's why it's good. That's why it's worth money. Well, this is giving everyone an entitlement to something exactly like that. A permanent guaranteed income stream into the future. Now, does it tie them into a financialized economy? Completely does. It integrates them into the monetary economy. It doesn't radically decommodify things, but it is much more egalitarian. I think it's one of the things that our research shows is guaranteeing people access to even relatively modest incomes has these quite egalitarian effects in income distribution, but it has, I think, much more profound psychological effects. You talk to people who are on New Start, half of the problem there is a lack of income, and it really is a serious problem. But a large chunk of it is a psychological degradation of the process you have to go through to be able to access income under our system, the conditionality and the stigma associated with it. Being able to help people out of that is one of the best ways, I think, of being able to protect them from the malicious effect of the asset economy. Giving them assets, I just don't think there's a way in capitalism of equally distributing assets. So eventually those assets will be very unequally distributed again. And the more you play into it, the more you entrench those unequal structures. We need to, in a sense, de-assetize things by turning things back into the real social goods and income streams that are the underpinning of that financialized economy. Doing that, I think, really does play a role, but it's really important to say, by itself, it can't solve the problem. In fact, if we privatise healthcare, privatise education, privatise housing, and only give people income, the costs of all those things are almost guaranteed to rise faster than the income they're getting. And we know the cost of housing has been rising fast, and education and health have all been rising faster than other costs in the economy. Yeah. So we also need to socialise those social goods. We also need to give people rights to healthcare, education, and housing. But in a monetary economy, we also need to give people a basic right to income, because you can't live a decent life in this society without it. And so it does need to be a right and not just something you get after dealing with the bureaucracy of Centrelink.
Yeah, I think that's all really interesting. And also, I should probably point out that both your project and Konings and Adkins, I would say, share an ambition of thinking about inequality outside of the Piketty-esque engagement with the hyper-rich versus the not, looking at inequality at all levels through the income scale. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. The article Between Universalism and Targeting, Exploring Policy Pathways for an Australian Basic Income will be available from the Economic and Labour Relations Review, I believe in early October.
Yeah, wonderful. Can't wait to see it up there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Bye.